911. Where's your emergency?
We just came into a friend's house and she's dead.
Does it appear to be natural, or you don't know?
I don't know.
Okay, all right.
Somebody tried to break in last night. Her car's gone.
All right, stay on the line with me, okay?
Oh my God. I'd say there's foul play here for sure.
We located the victim in her living room. She was lying on her couch, face up, and appeared to be wearing a nightrobe. She was laying in an odd position. It appeared that a struggle had taken place.
There were several things at the scene that weren't adding up. Most of the house was neat and in order, except for the room where the victim was found. The robe stash did appear to be in an odd place. It was lying on the floor near Patricia's hand, not around the robe like you would typically see a robe worn. The victim's vehicle was missing. According to the neighbors, nobody would have had permission to take the vehicle. Another thing missing from the house was a television set from the second floor. The fact that there were no signs of forced entry, we did have a theory that this might be somebody the victim would have had known and had access to the house. We're photographing, we're looking for physical evidence. Every little detail can make a difference in a case like this.
Patty was an adventurer. She had a thirst for knowledge. She loved travel, and she had a wicked sense of humor. She enjoyed outdoors, gardening, her flowers, and really just being there for other people. She was divorced, and she had 2 sons. She loved her boys, and she was very close to them. She had done a lot of philanthropy type work. If you were in need of anything, she would be there to help you. A friend called me and told me, she's gone. She's dead. And I broke down. It was gut-wrenching.
When I spoke to Daniel Dresser, he told us that there had been a break-in, and the person that Patricia suspected committed the break-in was Spencer Spielman. Spencer had been a friend of Patricia's other son, Nick Dresser, for quite a while, and Daniel Dresser told us that Spencer had approached Patricia asking for money. So Patricia would give Spencer money for helping out around the house, helping with the artwork, and Patricia had given him a garage code to get in the house.
She started noticing things missing, and she started getting a really weird feeling.
Wednesday, prior to her death, she said, Spencer keeps bugging me about wanting Nick's really nice watch. She said, I've really hid it in a great place. He'll never find it. Patty told me about Spencer stealing a few things when she wasn't home, and she thought he was looking for that watch. So she started texting him, and she was pretty mad about it. She also was texting her son Daniel about what was going on, and one of her texts was, I'm feeling a little scared.
The autopsy showed that the cause of death was strangulation.
The item used for the strangulation was, in fact, the rope sash that was lying by Patricia's hand. So it was confirmed that this was a homicide. We were keeping all options open to any possibility of involvement with anybody. But at this point in the investigation, we were looking pretty hard for Spencer Spielman.
emergency.
Did you guys find the blue Taurus that was stolen from Patty Dresser's house last night?
I have no idea.
Well, there's one sitting here at the village pantry on South 9 right now that it matches.
Who's with the car?
2 white guys.
Step out now! Put your hands on top of your head! Drop everything in your hands now! Step back towards me! Keep coming! Keep coming! Stop! Passenger in the vehicle! Step out with your hands up!
Ultimately, Spencer Spielman was identified as the driver of the vehicle. The second occupant was identified as Brandon Humphreys.
Anytime we have more than one person, we separate them so they can't talk and work their stories out.
I decided to interview Brandon Humphreys first to see what he knew about Spencer in the past 48 hours. What we're looking into is something very serious, okay? Do you know why you're here, why you were shot?
Absolutely not. I'm baffled right now.
Okay. Who's the guy that you're with?
His name's Spencer.
Okay.
He's an old friend of mine.
Obviously, you're in the car with him tonight.
Mm-hmm.
What do you know about the car?
He told me it was his mom, Patricia's.
Okay.
And he went to the gas station, and, I kind of got a little nosy, opened the glove box, and sure enough, there was a registration that said Patricia on it, so.
When he gave the information about the car belonging to Spencer's mom, that was a red flag. We obviously knew this wasn't true. You said you don't know anything about the car other than it being his mom's.
I'm kind of already putting 2 and 2 together.
Okay. The car's stolen. Okay. And you being in a stolen car doesn't look good. You understand that? That's why we're back here, and there's a bigger issue than that. The stolen vehicle you're in is attached to homicide.
Homicide? Mm-hmm. Like someone died in it?
He's starting to get nervous. His right knee is starting to bounce a little bit. He's not sure what's coming next.
What can you tell me that's going to help us clarify some things?
There's really no conversations about the car itself. He just said his mom was letting him borrow it.
Okay.
And I'm going to just tell you this now, just in case it pops up in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I did buy a TV off him. He said it came from his mom's house. So now I'm starting to think if the car was stolen.
What kind of TV was it?
It was a 55-inch Hitachi TV. And I took it to a pawn shop because I knew it was going to be money.
If you feel like you're holding something back to protect him?
No, at this point I can give a less about him.
Okay.
Because he had me in a stolen vehicle, and now I'm learning about there was is attached to a homicide.
Where our homicide happened, would there be any reason your DNA would be on any evidence inside the house?
Absolutely not. No.
If we get information from somebody else that you were involved and we're able to prove that, it's not going to look good. Are you sure there's nothing else?
I promise you there's nothing else. I know I'm innocent about all this.
I'm gonna have you stand against this wall.
Sit down. Yeah, you can sit down, man. Tell me why you think you're here.
Honestly, I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, obviously the car.
Okay.
Patty let me use it.
Okay. All right. Well, that's what we need to get to the bottom of.
I go over there to her house once or twice a week.
And we're talking about Patty.
Patty. And I like clean her house and stuff. Like she pays me like $100 once a month to do all her windows.
Okay.
Like clean her floors. All that.
First impression of Spencer is he's just nonchalant, no respect for anybody. He didn't have a care in the world.
I was cleaning and she got into a fight with some old guy who was over there. She's like, blah, blah, blah. I went down, I was like, I'm leaving. She's like, oh, she was like, she let me take her car. She said, just come back in the morning. She had to go to work. So she let me use her car. I come back in the morning. I couldn't get an answer from the door or anything. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't just gonna leave her car in her driveway, the keys in it.
This old guy that she was with, who is he?
I have no idea. When I was upstairs vacuuming, I heard her yell, John, like 3 times. So I'm guessing his name's John, but I'm not sure.
When you left, did you see anything in the driveway?
I think it was like an Expedition. It was really nice.
What color was it?
White.
We had already talked to the neighbors and looked at the surveillance video.
We knew there was no other cars there. There was no John, no white Expedition, no nothing.
You have a key to get in the residence?
I do not.
Okay.
She always lets me in. She's always sitting in the garage.
Have you got the door code? Like the keypad for the
garage door?
Yeah. So Thursday morning, is that when you brought the car back?
I got there like 7. I waited for a couple hours. I'm not even gonna lie to y'all.
Okay. But she would just never answer the door?
Mm-mm. There was not an answer.
Spencer told us that he wasn't able to get a hold of Patricia, so he decided to go ahead and keep the vehicle at that point.
So now we're into Friday today. What did you do when you woke up?
Went to Brandon's, loaded up one of his rims for his car. Went and tried to sell them. Pawn shops wouldn't give a for them.
Did you guys pawn anything?
No.
Okay.
At this point, we already had video of Spencer and Brandon pawning a TV. So we knew that he was lying about that.
But we know you're lying.
I ain't lying about nothing.
We've already been checking with the pawn shops, okay? We know you pawn stuff. So you had to be honest.
In there on video.
We wanted Spencer to know that we know what happened, and sometimes a suspect will feel the inclination to confess.
I just asked you if you pawn stuff. You told me no. So this is the time to be honest and clear.
I am being honest.
You pawned a TV.
Do what?
55-inch TV.
Yeah.
Why didn't you tell us about that?
I didn't think it was.
You didn't think it was relevant?
Yeah.
Was there an agreement between you and Patty?
No.
For you to take that TV?
No.
Then why did you take it?
Because I needed money. That's the only thing I took from the house.
The moment that he admitted that he took the TV from the house, definitely felt like that was progress.
So the TV you took, was she home when you took it?
Do what? No.
How'd you get in the house then?
The garage door clicky thing.
The White Expedition.
Mm-hmm.
They're on Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the truth.
Yeah, it is. How is that not the truth?
There's video cameras. You gotta stop lying to us.
I'm not lying to you guys.
Okay. Yeah, you are.
We're shooting holes all in your story. This is a big, big deal.
What are you talking about?
What do you think we're talking about?
I'm not sure.
If you had to guess, what do you think?
Well, y'all obviously think I stole the car.
The more that we start to challenge him, we call out his lies, the more closed-postured, the more kind of standoffish he gets with us, the more argumentative he gets with us.
Can y'all just please tell me what's going on?
We're giving you the opportunity to tell us. We know the answer.
Burglary? What are you talking about, burglary?
Stolen car.
I didn't steal no car.
I was trying to get him agitated. Sometimes when you get somebody mad, you know, you get a different reaction. Go here, go there, go for the throat.
What the going on?
Murder.
Bull.
Murder.
I didn't kill nobody.
Apparently you did.
The
You sit here and lie about everything else. Why would you lie about that?
You stole her car.
No. What?
Broke in her house, stole her TV.
No.
Stole a car, stole a Wi-Fi.
I didn't kill nobody or
Apparently
steal
you did.
anything.
Then you better tell us who did.
I don't know.
Yeah, right.
You better.
I don't have the balls to murder anybody.
Maybe you didn't mean to.
What?
Everybody was frustrated at that point. And so sometimes you have to do an attention getter. Time to do it or the Hail Mary, you know, let's throw the ball or go home.
This is your opportunity to tell us what happened.
I don't know.
Why, since you sit your ass in that chair. You know it. You sit there and thought it all up and you thought you had it all figured out.
No, I did not.
John. Who the hell is John?
I did not.
White truck. We got video. There ain't no white truck around.
I didn't
Tell us the
anybody.
truth. Save your life.
You.
You were there. She's dead. You got her car. I'm a jury member. What am I going to think?
I didn't kill her.
It's like you don't have any emotion that she's dead.
No, I care. I just don't show it.
Spencer, let me ask you this.
I
Okay.
didn't kill anybody.
We were getting nowhere. So we got to try something different here. So with Spencer, I said, okay, let's just go back. Walk me through it one more time and just see where it goes.
And who was there when you left?
That dude. I'm not lying about that either.
We've gone over and verified the times on the video. There's no expedition there. Okay. Are you saying that just because you're scared?
Yeah. I didn't.
But there's no expedition, right? We're finally getting somewhere. Okay. What were you scared about coming up with a story about her getting in the argument?
Oh, she did. She was screaming at somebody on the phone.
But that was on the phone. Did she ever take any of that anger and turn it toward you? Like, did she tell you to get out of the house?
Pretty much. And as I'm walking out the garage door, I got hit in the back of the head with something really hard. And all I remember is waking up in the Walmart parking lot with a TV in the trunk.
It hadn't been hurt, right?
I don't know, it was in the garage. I don't know what she grabbed.
Was she cussing at you?
She was going nuts.
So now he's put himself in the house. He's put himself in contact with her. He's slowly surrendering to us. We just got that little bit more to go.
Do you ever remember her falling? Having to help her up?
I think, no, she did fall. She knocked the chair over.
Did you help her up at any point to like the couch? Did she fall down? That stuff's
Yeah,
going to help.
I walked her over to the couch.
So you helped her on the couch?
Yeah. And she laid down.
She had a robe on when you picked her up and put her on the couch.
Yeah.
The robe, like the strap where you tie it, that was on the floor?
It was right there by the couch, I think, on the floor.
So she fell out of the chair. You've helped her onto the couch.
She hit you in the back of the head.
And I took her car and left.
We know he's not being truthful. That's when we start throwing little bits of information to get his mind thinking, okay, they know a little bit. How much do they know?
When we went to the autopsy, that robe The marks around her neck, that robe was wrapped around her neck, that tie.
Oh, I didn't do that. Hell no.
We're trying to figure out how that got around her neck.
I had to choke her with it.
No, we're losing you.
Everybody's just exhausted. So we were getting ready to have a little break.
You want a cigarette, right?
Sure.
I took Spencer outside to go smoke a cigarette.
You want to go right out that exit door?
It was all video recorded on a body-worn camera to make sure there was nothing said or no promises made or no coercion or anything like that.
Right out there.
Got him out of the room for a minute for a reset, and once we walked out the door, we did not talk about this case at all. He was kind of looking out into the darkness. And I don't know if that gave him an opportunity to see that we were actually human. After the smoke break, we walked back in. I put him in the chair, and he looks at me, and he says,
I'm ready to tell y'all what happened.
I'm not sure why the smoke break had such an impact. Maybe he just realized that it's done. There ain't no way out of this. So I get Mike, and I'm like, hey, come on. He said he's ready to give it to us, and everybody's mouth just was open and all.
At least you got a cigarette, right?
When I let her down on the couch, like a few minutes later, she just came up freaking the out, hitting me and trying to scratch at me, and I just tightened it left. And I came back, and by that time, when I took it off, it was too late.
I was shocked.
I was shocked, but after he ended up confessing, it was that relief that we did get the truth.
The autopsy showed that it had been around twice before it was tightened. So we wanted him to say that he did do that because only the person who put it there would know.
So she's on the couch, she jumps up. Where was the belt, sash, whatever we want to call it?
On the little table.
Did you talk about the table next to the couch?
Yeah. So somehow you managed to get that just around once or?
Twice, and then
when he made the motion, he went, which would be twice, and then he pulled it. And he said he recalled pulling it tight. And he said after he did that, she fell on the couch and he left. He said he came back the next morning about 7 o'clock to feed the dog and noticed she was still on the couch. She was gray, and he knew at that time it was too late. And instead of calling 911, he just left. This was the longest interview that I've ever sat on. So to get it was great, to get a confession.
20-year-old Spencer Spielman is accused of strangling Patricia Dresser. He faces charges of murder, robbery, and driving while suspended.
We were very satisfied with the way the outcome was. At the end of the day, we're speaking for Patricia.
You have to stay resilient and determined to find the truth. And in this case, we were able to provide justice to Patricia and give her family answers.
Patty Dresser was 52 when her life was taken away. I think about her every day, and I miss her every day.
Flora Rundle was a widow. She was 71 years of age. She had no children, and she was very self-reliant. Her sisters tried to contact her, but were unable to reach her. So the two of them actually drove over to her place. As they approached the front door, they happened to notice that the front door was ajar, about 3 inches wide. They knew that was very unusual for Flora because she always would keep her door closed and locked. As they entered into the residence, one of the sisters went into the bathroom. Flora was lying on the bathroom floor, unclothed, with a pool of blood around her. One of her sisters actually picked up the telephone to try to contact 911, but the line was dead. A deputy sheriff verified that she was deceased. He also noticed the residence had been ransacked. Some type of a struggle had occurred. There was damage to the door, indicating that there was some type of forced entry. Her telephone line, which was connected into her residence, was cut just above the eave of her home. The deputy believed that this was some type of a suspicious death and contacted the homicide unit. Later on in the investigation, the autopsy revealed that Flora had been stabbed 11 times, probably with a knife 6 to 7 inches in length. We're back in the late 80s. Back then, there wasn't DNA. So as far as fingernails and swabs being collected, they really couldn't determine much.
Any idea who may have done this to Flora?
Oh, no, I have no idea. She was a white person. She stayed by herself a lot. She didn't have girlfriends or children. She'd always get home before dark because she was afraid to go in the house at night. Can't imagine anybody wanting to do it for her other than the money.
And how much money would you say she had?
She told me a while back that she had $2,000. I'm sure she had that money. I'm positive. I said to her, now don't tell anybody that you've got this money, Flora. You got to be quiet.
Where did she have the money?
She had it in her purse, and she'd count it there in front of me. She says, I carry it with me. That's the only place it's safe. She says, I have no children or anything. She says, I'm saving it toward my burial.
Who else would she have told about the money?
There was a nephew of mine, Harold Whitehead, that used to come and see her.
Would she have told Harold about the money?
Maybe she would have.
Flora routinely would talk to other family members about having these $20, $100 bills in this prescribed medication bottle that she would carry around with her. She made that known to her family so that at some point, if she passed away, she's not going to be a burden on her other siblings. The detectives went and canvassed the neighborhood. They were not able to locate that medication bottle with the money inside.
Did you know if Flora had any money?
She sat right around and showed it to me.
She'd hoard her money, and she didn't trust banks.
What about Harold? He would go see Flora a lot. What kind of person's Harold?
Flora and Harold are good friends, but he drinks.
Yeah.
And when he drinks, he goes crazy. And she didn't like him around if he was drunk. She said all he comes here for is he wants more money to get more booze.
Personally myself, I feel the motive for her death was probably robbery. I want to know where the hell the money went.
Some of the information that we received from the sisters was that Flora didn't drive and would occasionally use taxi services to get to doctor's appointments and to the grocery store. So detectives contacted the taxi companies, and they actually were able to identify a couple of different taxi companies that had picked up Flora. After making contacts with the taxi drivers, detectives didn't believe they had any information regarding the death of Flora. I really believe detectives did everything they possibly could back in the 80s, and it just kind of came to a point where they didn't have anything else to go on. They're just kind of at a dead end. Today, technology has greatly advanced. After reviewing the case, I realized there were fingernail clippings and there was a pair of slacks found on Flora's bed at the time of the crime that potentially could yield DNA. I submitted those two items to a private lab for testing. They were able to determine that there was DNA from an unknown male on Flora's fingernails and also on her slacks. There was a match on the DNA, and the match came back to an individual by the name of Gary Dean Hilfiger. So I started doing research on Gary and realized that he was already in the Utah State Prison for another murder that actually occurred in 1992, so it would have occurred after Flora Rundle's murder. His parole date for the 1992 homicide was April of this year, 2022. So the next step would be to go and try to interview Gary. I did as much research as I possibly could do, but in these cases, it's always a gamble. I never know whether they will talk or won't talk. Right. Thank you. Hey, Gary. My name is Ben, and this is my partner, Todd. Gary was very well versed with the criminal justice system. I wasn't going to be surprised if he would have just asked for an attorney, and that would have been the end of the interview.
The case that I'm investigating happened back in 1989, and it involved a lady by the name of Flora Rundle. Her sisters found her deceased. I believe during that time you were a cab driver.
Yeah.
Since that time, obviously, technology and different things change, and I was assigned the case. I want to be able to take your side of the story.
I vaguely remember this person. I remember her from work.
Did you take her places sometimes?
Right.
Okay.
I know I've done some stuff out there, but I don't know if I did this. I can't say I did or didn't.
What happened that day? What happened that night?
I ain't got a clue.
Can you tell me about it?
I can't, because I don't remember.
Do you remember the house that she lived in? That little brown house there?
It doesn't ring a bell for me.
He was so stoic and not really volunteering any information, which made it an extreme challenge. We were concerned that he might not give us answers. So I'm looking for things that really mean something to get him to trust us.
I know during that time you were involved in drugs, but I also know since that time, Gary, that you've been involved in religion. I know you found Jesus Christ, our Savior, and I know you changed your ways. Part of repentance is admitting what we've done. And what I want to talk to you about is what happened and why it happened.
Okay.
You're not a bad guy, Gary.
No, I'm a bad guy. That's why I'm in prison.
Wouldn't it be nice for people to actually see a change in you since you have found Jesus Christ? The old Gary was the one that didn't remember anything, but the new Gary is taking responsibility.
There's a lot of things I've done I don't know why I did.
When I started leaning into the faith with Gary, I could tell that he was conflicted. I could tell that he was either on the verge of saying, I'm done, take me back, or he's going to talk to us.
I want you to tell me the story of what happened with Flora. That's what I want.
I'm still looking at this house, and he doesn't really click with me.
Gary, there's things that we know happened because of the physical evidence.
I was able to find your DNA under her fingernails. There's no reason for your DNA to be underneath her fingernails. There's no reason for your DNA to be within her house.
Why else would my DNA be there? Like what you said, that I was there. But I've had dreams about things, and maybe I did do this.
Can you tell me about those dreams?
I can't. I mean, it's like I'm there, but I'm not there, sort of thing.
Right.
When he's talking about dreams, I think he's stalling for time for him to make a decision on which way he was going to go in this interview.
So what are the dreams?
It would just, I don't know, it'd be like a panorama, just a thing, to where that I'm seeing bits and pieces.
What kind of things would you see?
It was a struggle because I went there to rob her, I guess. And I said, I guess because I can't really remember.
Did you cut the utility lines?
I probably did.
He's still trying to keep some distance with the dream aspect of it. Dreams are fine, but we want him to admit that he was actually at the scene. Having a confession makes it a lot easier to convict him.
Would you have used a type of a weapon?
Yeah.
Like what?
A knife.
How much money did you get?
It was like a couple $100.
Where was it?
In a purse, I think.
Were you afraid that she may have recognized you?
Obviously.
So then after you took the money, that's when you stabbed her. Is that correct?
Yeah. I went there at night and broke in. Looked in the front door. She got up, asked me what I was doing. I told her I just wanted some money. And then I seen her purse, and I went to get it, and that was when the struggle began. I think I pushed her. She went down. I got the money, and she got up, grabbed it, and then I pulled out my knife and I killed her.
Did you plan on killing her?
No.
Why Flora?
No reason in particular.
We were extremely happy that Gary admitted to murdering Flora Rundle. In this case, we just talked to Gary and we treated him as a human, and I truly believe that's why we got the results we got from Gary.
I was going to ask you guys if that you would be with me.
Sure. Be happy to. We ask the Father in heaven that He will watch over Gary and give him the comfort that he needs as he's made great strides since his past. And we say these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
It is with deep sorrow and regret that I write this to admit my responsibility in Flora's death. At the time when I murdered Flora, I was addicted to cocaine and drinking alcohol. No excuses. I was still responsible for my actions. I am deeply sorry.
It's very nice, Gary.
Very good.
I thank you both.
I pray that you will find peace within yourself, knowing that you did the right thing today.
These types of cases really emotionally take it out of you because one wrong move or one wrong word said could shut down the interview. Fortunately for us, Gary continued to talk and did the right thing for the family and everyone else involved. He pled straight up guilty to the charge, and he was sentenced to life without parole. And of course, the parole date for April of 2022 for the other murder was revoked as well. I was able to meet with Flora's relatives and give them Gary's apology letter. They appreciated the fact that he would write something to them. It makes it a lot easier for everybody involved when somebody's willing to take responsibility for what they've done. I've since learned from Gary that as they were driving over for the interview, a Christian song came on the radio. For Gary, I think the stars aligned, and I think he really believed it was time to confess to what he had done. He wanted to take responsibility, and he wanted to give the family some answers.
April 16, 2007 began like any other Monday in the quiet college town of Blacksburg, Virginia. The air was still cool with the last breath of early spring, the kind that lingers just before the sun fully claims the day. Students shuffled across campus, clutching coffee cups, backpacks slung over tired shoulders, their minds drifting between lectures, deadlines, and the small, ordinary worries of young adulthood. It was a day that should have dissolved into routine memory, indistinguishable from the hundreds that came before it. But by mid-morning, time itself would feel fractured, divided forever into before and after. At 7:15 a.m., inside a dormitory known as West Ambler Johnston Hall, something shattered the fragile calm. It wasn't just the sound, though that sound would echo in memory for years. It was the abrupt rupture of normalcy. A sharp crack cut through the hallway, followed by another. Doors remained closed. A few students stirred in their beds, confused, unsure if what they heard was real or some distant noise bleeding through dreams. For a moment, uncertainty held everything in suspension. Then came the silence. Not the comforting silence of early morning, but something heavier. Something wrong. In a dorm room, a young woman lay motionless. Her name was Emily Hilscher. Just hours earlier, she had been alive in the ordinary way people are, making plans, exchanging messages, existing in the quiet rhythm of her own life. Now, that rhythm had been violently interrupted. Nearby, another student, Ryan Clark, had tried to respond, to intervene, to understand what was happening. He never had the chance. And just like that, the day had changed. But the world outside that building didn't know it yet. Classes continued. Students crossed the campus lawns. Professors prepared lectures. The machinery of a university day moved forward, unaware that something far more dangerous than a single incident had just begun to unfold. Authorities were called, but early assumptions painted the scene as an isolated act, a personal dispute, contained and finished. There was no urgency to warn the entire campus. No alarm that would ripple through classrooms and dormitories. Just a quiet investigation, beginning behind closed doors. Meanwhile, somewhere else on campus, a young man walked alone. Sunghui Cho moved with an unsettling calm, the kind that doesn't draw attention, because it blends too easily into the background. He didn't run. He didn't shout. There was no outward sign of panic or hesitation. If anyone had passed him that morning, they might have noticed nothing at all, just another student heading somewhere, lost in thought, as so many are. But inside him, something had already crossed a line. There is a moment, in acts like these, that can never be fully seen from the outside. A point where thought becomes decision, where grievance hardens into intent. Whatever storm had been building inside Cho, it was no longer contained. It had found direction. And it was moving forward. Nearly 2 hours passed. 2 hours in which life continued as normal across Virginia Tech. 2 hours in which laughter echoed in hallways, notebooks filled with hurried handwriting, and conversations drifted between the trivial and the meaningful. 2 hours that would later feel unbearable in their lost potential, as if time itself had offered a chance, however slim, to interrupt what was coming next. But that chance slipped away unnoticed. At approximately 9:40 a.m., Cho entered Norris Hall. If the first attack had been a rupture, what followed was a storm. Inside the building, classrooms were in session. Students sat in rows, some listening intently, others distracted by the quiet monotony of lecture. The world outside those walls might as well not have existed. It was a contained, predictable environment, the kind where nothing truly dangerous is expected to happen. That illusion would not last. Cho moved methodically. There was no rush in his movements, no visible frenzy. Instead, there was a deliberate precision, as though each step had already been rehearsed in his mind. At the entrances, chains were used to block the doors from the inside, sealing the building. It was a small action, almost mechanical, but its consequence was enormous. It turned Norris Hall into a trap. Then, the shooting began. The sound was unmistakable now. Loud. Repeating. Close. Confusion spread first, as it often does. Students looked at each other, unsure if what they were hearing was real. Some thought it was construction noise, or something dropped, or anything that could still fit within the boundaries of normal explanation. But denial doesn't hold for long when reality insists on breaking through. Screams followed. Inside classrooms, chaos erupted. Some students tried to barricade doors, pushing desks and chairs against them with trembling hands. Others dropped to the floor, instinctively seeking cover where there was none. A few made desperate decisions in split seconds, running, hiding, or, in some cases, choosing to leap from windows rather than remain trapped inside. Each moment stretched, warped by fear. Time lost its structure. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like something much longer, something without end. Cho moved from room to room. There was no conversation. No warning. Just the relentless continuation of violence. The kind that doesn't pause to consider, doesn't hesitate, doesn't allow space for negotiation or mercy. It was an unfolding sequence of irreversible moments, each one building on the last. And outside, the world was finally beginning to understand. Emergency calls flooded in. Reports of an active shooter spread through law enforcement channels. Sirens cut through the morning air as police raced toward the campus. But distance, even a short one, becomes unbearable in moments like these. Every second feels stolen. Every delay feels catastrophic. Inside Norris Hall, those seconds were everything. Some professors tried to shield their students, placing themselves between danger and the people in their care. Others worked frantically to secure doors, to create barriers where none had been designed. Students clung to one another, to anything that offered even the illusion of safety. In those moments, instinct revealed itself in raw, unfiltered ways, fear, courage, confusion, all tangled together. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Police breached the building. They moved quickly, trained for scenarios like this, but nothing prepares you for the reality waiting on the other side of a door. The silence they encountered was not relief. It was the aftermath. Sunghui Cho was found dead, having taken his own life before officers could reach him. In the span of just over 2 hours, 32 people had been killed. 32 lives, each one carrying its own story, its own network of relationships, its own future that would now never unfold. Friends, classmates, teachers, individuals who had woken up that morning with plans, routines, expectations. None of them could have imagined how their day would end. And beyond the numbers, there was something else. Something harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. A rupture in the sense of safety. Virginia Tech was not supposed to be a place where something like this could happen. Universities are built on the idea of openness, of learning, exploration, community. They are spaces where young people step into independence, where futures begin to take shape. The violence that unfolded that morning didn't just take lives. It shattered assumptions. In the hours and days that followed, the campus would transform. Where there had been movement, there was stillness. Where there had been noise, there was quiet reflection. Vigils formed. Candles flickered against the darkness. Names were spoken, remembered, held onto with a kind of collective urgency, as if saying them aloud could somehow keep them from fading. But beneath the mourning, questions began to surface. How had this happened? Why had there been no warning after the first shooting? Could anything have been done differently? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what had been happening inside the mind of the person who carried this out? Those questions would linger, not just for the people of Virginia Tech, but for an entire nation trying to make sense of something that resists understanding. Because tragedies like this don't end when the violence stops. They echo. In memories. In policies. In the quiet, persistent awareness that something once thought impossible has already happened, and could, under the wrong circumstances, happen again. That Monday morning in April did not simply pass into history. It stayed. And for those who lived through it, for those who lost someone, for those who would later study it, analyze it, and try to understand it, April 16, 2007 became more than a date. It became a dividing line. A moment where the ordinary collapsed into something unthinkable. And a story that would demand to be told, again and again, in the hope that somewhere within it, there might be answers, or at least, a deeper understanding of the silence that comes just before everything changes. Blacksburg, Virginia had always carried the quiet rhythm of a town built around a university. On most mornings, the streets felt gently animated rather than busy, as if the entire place was breathing at a slower, steadier pace than the outside world. Coffee shops opened their doors to familiar faces. Buses rolled along predictable routes. Students crossed intersections half awake, adjusting to the weight of another academic week. It was not a city that expected violence. It was not a place where people locked their doors out of fear. It was a place where the future felt close enough to touch. At the center of this town stood Virginia Tech, officially known as Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Its campus stretched across rolling hills, brick buildings, and tree-lined walkways that shifted with the seasons. In spring, the air carried the scent of damp earth and budding leaves. In April 2007, that spring had fully arrived, painting the campus in soft greens and pale sunlight that filtered through branches like scattered glass. Students moved through this environment with the familiar blend of ambition and fatigue. There were engineering majors buried in calculations, literature students carrying annotated books, graduate assistants balancing teaching responsibilities with their own research. Every corner of campus held some fragment of human effort directed toward the future. It was a place defined by motion, even in its quietest moments. West Ambler Johnston Hall, where the first act of violence would take place, was one of the largest residence halls on campus. It was home to hundreds of students, mostly freshmen, many of whom were experiencing independence for the first time in their lives. The building itself was not remarkable in appearance. It was functional, structured, and designed for community living. Long hallways connected rows of doors, each one marking a private world behind thin walls. Inside those rooms were posters, textbooks, laundry baskets, photographs from home, and the small personal artifacts of young adulthood. On the morning of April 16th, those rooms were still wrapped in the softness of early routine. Some students were asleep, others were already awake, but unhurried, scrolling through messages, or preparing for morning classes. The building hummed with the subtle sounds of shared living, distant footsteps, the occasional closing door, the faint vibration of alarms being silenced too quickly. Outside, the sky was pale and steady, neither stormy nor bright enough to draw attention. It was the kind of weather that does not announce itself, that simply exists as background. Virginia Tech itself carried a long academic tradition, and like many large universities, it also carried the quiet complexity of mental health struggles among its students. Pressure, isolation, and transition often coexisted beneath the surface of campus life. Counseling services existed, faculty were trained to notice warning signs, and administrative systems were in place to respond to crises. Yet no system, no matter how carefully designed, can fully anticipate the shape of a single individual's internal world when it begins to fracture. Among the thousands of students on campus was Sung-Hui Cho. To many who encountered him, he appeared withdrawn, distant, often silent in ways that made interaction difficult. He was not known for social connection, nor for academic distinction in the traditional sense. Instead, he existed on the edges of campus life, physically present but emotionally removed, as if observing rather than participating. Cho's presence in academic spaces had often been marked by discomfort among peers and instructors. His communication style was limited, sometimes unsettling, and he struggled significantly with social interaction. Over time, this isolation became part of how he was perceived. Not as someone fully integrated into the university community, but as someone who remained outside it, even while enrolled within it. Years before April 2007, concerns about his mental health had already surfaced. Evaluations had pointed to significant social anxiety and depressive symptoms. At one point, legal intervention had required mental health treatment, an acknowledgement that his internal state had reached a level of concern beyond the ordinary struggles of student life. Yet after treatment and evaluation, he was allowed to continue his education. On paper, he was one student among many. In practice, he remained disconnected from the social fabric that held the campus together. Virginia Tech, like most universities, was not designed to continuously monitor the psychological state of every individual in real time. It relied on self-reporting, on visible signs, on intervention when behaviors became clearly disruptive or dangerous. Between those thresholds, a person could move through the system largely unseen. On April 16, this gap between visibility and internal reality would become painfully apparent. The early hours of the day gave no indication of what was coming. Professors prepared lectures in offices lined with books and papers. Administrative staff answered emails and organized schedules. Students checked assignment deadlines and planned their day around classes, meals, and brief moments of rest. Life on campus was structured, predictable, and anchored in repetition. Even emergency preparedness drills, which had occasionally been conducted, existed more as abstract procedures than lived reality. They were exercises in imagination, scenarios discussed, but rarely emotionally integrated. The idea that a violent attack could unfold within academic buildings felt distant, almost theoretical. Yet within that same environment, Cho was already in motion. The university landscape, with its interconnected buildings and open pathways, allowed for easy movement between spaces. Norris Hall, the site of the second and most devastating phase of the tragedy, was an academic building dedicated primarily to engineering departments. It contained classrooms, lecture halls, and offices. Like many buildings of its kind, it was designed for accessibility rather than defense. Doors opened into shared corridors. Windows allowed natural light to enter rooms where students spent hours studying complex systems and abstract theories. It was a place built for learning, not for containment. The culture of the university also reflected a deep trust in openness. Doors were often left unlocked during the day. Students moved freely between classes without significant security barriers. Visitors could enter buildings without extensive checks. This openness was not negligence but philosophy, rooted in the belief that educational spaces should remain accessible. On that morning, however, that philosophy would be tested in a way no one had imagined. As the day progressed toward mid-morning, the campus began to fully awaken. The first wave of classes had already begun. Students settled into seats, professors wrote equations on chalkboards, or projected slides onto screens. Conversations faded into academic focus. Outside, sunlight strengthened slightly, casting clearer shadows along walkways and building facades. It was a moment of convergence, when thousands of individual routines aligned into a shared temporal rhythm. A campus fully in motion, unaware that it was about to be violently interrupted. Inside this structure of normalcy, there was no visible signal of impending catastrophe. No collective intuition that something was wrong. Humans are remarkably adaptive to continuity. When life behaves predictably, the mind rarely searches for disruption. And so, Virginia Tech continued forward. In residence halls, students finished breakfast and prepared for the day. In libraries, early researchers organized notes. In classrooms, attendance was being recorded. Every action reinforced the expectation that the day would proceed as planned. Yet beneath this surface, a single trajectory was forming that would collide with this entire system of ordinary life. Blacksburg itself remained unaware of what was unfolding within its university. The town's rhythm did not yet reflect disruption. Cars moved through intersections. Shop owners arranged displays. The surrounding mountains stood unchanged, indifferent to human events. This contrast between the calm exterior world and the internal trajectory of one individual would become one of the most haunting aspects of what was about to happen. Because nothing in the environment announced it. Nothing in the weather, the architecture, or the daily routine indicated rupture. The tragedy would emerge not from the landscape, but from within it. And as the morning continued to advance, the distance between ordinary time and irreversible time began to close. No one could see it closing. Not the students walking to class, not the professors preparing lectures, not the administrators reviewing schedules. The world was still operating under the assumption that it would continue to operate as it always had. But within that assumption, something had already shifted. A line had been crossed in a place no one could observe. And the consequences of that crossing were already on their way. The stories of victims in tragedies like the Virginia Tech shooting are often remembered through numbers first. 32 lives lost. 17 injured. A sequence of statistics that attempts to contain something fundamentally uncontainable. But behind each number was a person who existed in full complexity long before the events of April 16, 2007. Each of them carried a private world of memories, relationships, routines, and future plans that extended far beyond the boundaries of that single morning. To understand what was taken that day is to step away from abstraction and into the fragile texture of human life as it actually was. Emily Hilscher was 18 years old, a freshman who had only recently begun to build her life within the rhythm of Virginia Tech. She came from Loudoun County, Virginia, a place not far in distance, but far enough in experience from the independence she was now navigating. Those who knew her described her as someone who carried a quiet steadiness, a young woman still shaping her identity in the space between adolescence and adulthood. College had been her new beginning, a chance to explore who she might become beyond the familiar boundaries of home. On the morning of April 16th, Emily was inside West Ambler Johnston Hall. It was early, and like many students in residence halls across campus, her day was still forming. Perhaps she was preparing for class, perhaps she was still easing into wakefulness. The details of those final moments remain locked in the quiet obscurity that often surrounds sudden violence. What is known is that her life ended there, abruptly, in a place that was supposed to represent safety and transition rather than danger. Emily's death would later be described in official reports, but for her family and friends, it could never be reduced to documentation. She was a daughter, a friend, a presence in the lives of those who loved her. Her absence would not only be felt in grief, but in the everyday moments where her voice, her laughter, and her future presence were expected but never arrived. Nearby, another student was also caught in the first moments of the attack. Ryan Clark was a senior, a resident assistant in the same building. He was 22 years old, originally from Martinez, Georgia. Those who knew him often described him as responsible, grounded, and deeply attentive to others. His role as a resident assistant reflected a sense of care for the community around him, a willingness to look out for fellow students in the shared environment of campus living. When the violence began inside West Ambler Johnston Hall, Ryan responded in a way that aligned with that sense of responsibility. He moved toward the situation rather than away from it. That choice placed him directly in harm's way. His death occurred during those early moments of confusion and shock, when the nature of what was happening was still not fully understood by those outside the immediate space of the incident. In the aftermath, Ryan would be remembered not only as a victim, but as someone who acted in accordance with his character, even in a moment that offered no possibility of control or resolution. His story became part of a broader narrative about courage in the face of sudden violence, though for those who knew him personally, such language could never fully capture the loss of a life interrupted. As the morning progressed toward Norris Hall, the circle of victims expanded rapidly. Within that building were students and faculty members engaged in the ordinary work of education. Among them was Professor Liviu Librescu, a 76-year-old Holocaust survivor, who had lived through one of the darkest chapters of human history before dedicating his life to engineering education. He was teaching a class in structural engineering that morning, standing before students who were focused on diagrams, equations, and academic explanation. When the attack reached his classroom, Librescu made a decision that would later be widely remembered. He positioned himself between the shooter and the students, attempting to hold the door as others sought escape through the windows. His actions created a brief barrier in a moment where barriers were fragile and temporary at best. Several students were able to survive by fleeing through the windows, an act of desperation that became their only path to safety. Inside that classroom, time collapsed into chaos. The structured environment of learning dissolved into survival. Desks were overturned, voices rose in panic, and the predictable order of an academic lecture was replaced by instinctive responses to immediate danger. Those who survived carried with them not only physical escape, but the psychological imprint of a moment where everything familiar had vanished. Other victims across Norris Hall included students from a wide range of backgrounds and academic disciplines. Each classroom represented a different field of study, a different trajectory of life in progress. Engineering students, who had been solving technical problems. German language students engaged in conversation exercises. Individuals who had chosen Virginia Tech for its academic reputation, its campus life, its promise of future opportunity. In room 211, students were attending German class when the attack entered their space. Some attempted to protect themselves and others. The sequence of events unfolded quickly, leaving little time for structured response. In room 204, another class was similarly disrupted, its academic setting transformed into a scene of survival and loss. The violence did not discriminate between academic focus or personal background. It moved through rooms in a sequence that would later be reconstructed through forensic investigation, but at the time unfolded as a series of fragmented, traumatic experiences for those inside. Outside Norris Hall, the broader campus remained unaware for a critical window of time. The delay in understanding what was happening contributed to the scale of the tragedy. Early assumptions about the first shooting had led authorities to believe the threat was contained. As a result, no immediate campus-wide alert was issued after the initial incident. This gap between perception and reality would later become a central point of scrutiny in reviews of the emergency response. For students elsewhere on campus, the morning continued with minimal disruption. Some heard distant sounds, but interpreted them through the lens of everyday ambiguity. Universities are environments filled with noise, construction, movement, and activity. Not every sound signals danger. And in the absence of clear information, the mind often defaults to normal explanation. This cognitive tendency toward normalization delayed recognition of the full scope of the situation. As the attack inside Norris Hall continued, the number of victims increased rapidly. Students in multiple classrooms were killed within minutes. Some were wounded while attempting to escape. Others remained trapped behind doors that had been locked or blocked from the inside. The spatial constraints of the building, designed for academic use rather than emergency evacuation, became a defining factor in the unfolding tragedy. Each victim's experience within those moments was distinct, yet united by a shared rupture in expectation. A classroom is typically a space of structured attention, where authority, learning, and routine govern behavior. In those minutes, that structure dissolved completely. When law enforcement finally entered Norris Hall, they encountered a scene of profound devastation. The violence had already ended, but its consequences remained fully present in the physical environment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was saturated with absence. Across campus, as the reality of what had occurred became clear, the identities of those affected began to emerge. Names were confirmed. Families were notified. The abstract count of casualties began to transform into individual narratives of loss. For the university community, the shift from uncertainty to recognition was emotionally overwhelming. Each confirmed name represented not just a death, but a rupture in a network of relationships that extended far beyond campus boundaries. Parents, siblings, friends, classmates, and mentors all became part of the expanding emotional geography of the tragedy. In the hours that followed, Virginia Tech would begin to gather itself into collective mourning. But at the center of that mourning were individuals whose lives had been interrupted in a place that was meant to support their growth, not end it. The victims of April 16 were not defined by the moment of their deaths. They were defined by everything that came before it. And in remembering them, the tragedy expands, beyond its immediate horror, into something more enduring. A reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be disrupted, and how many futures can be lost in the span of a single morning. By the time the mourning reached its midpoint on April 16, 2007, Virginia Tech was already moving through the familiar cadence of academic life. Classrooms were filled, lecture halls were active, and the campus had settled into the predictable rhythm of a university weekday. In many ways, nothing appeared unusual. Students moved between buildings with coffee in hand, conversations drifting from weekend plans to upcoming exams. Professors stood before chalkboards or projectors, guiding discussions through the structured language of education. It was a world built on continuity, where each hour typically flowed into the next without disruption. Inside Norris Hall, that continuity still existed in fragile form. Doors were open, classes were in session, and students sat in rows facing their instructors. The building itself was quiet in the way academic spaces often are during lectures, filled with focused attention and the soft sounds of writing, shifting chairs, and spoken explanation. Outside the windows, the campus appeared unchanged, the trees steady in the mild spring air, the walkways moving with their usual flow of students. Within that ordinary structure, however, something irreversible was already in motion. Sunghui Cho entered Norris Hall carrying with him a set of intentions that no one around him could perceive. There was no announcement, no visible signal that the space was about to be transformed. To the students and faculty inside, he was simply another figure moving through a shared academic environment. Universities are designed around this kind of permeability. People enter and exit buildings constantly. Strangers pass each other without interaction. The assumption of safety is built into every unlocked door and every open corridor. Cho moved through this environment with a calm that did not attract immediate attention. His behavior did not initially disrupt the visual logic of the space. He did not shout or draw attention to himself in a way that would immediately signal danger. Instead, his presence blended into the background of academic movement, where individual students often appear indistinguishable in the flow of daily activity. At some point during this movement, he secured access to parts of the building in a way that would later prove critical to the unfolding tragedy. By restricting entry and exit points, he altered the fundamental structure of the space. A building designed for circulation and openness was quietly transformed into something more confined, where movement became restricted and escape routes were no longer freely available. Inside the classrooms, lectures continued. Professors explained concepts related to engineering, language, and theory. Students followed along, taking notes or listening with varying degrees of attention. Some were focused entirely on the material, while others were mentally elsewhere, thinking about assignments or the remainder of the day. This range of attention is typical in academic settings, where concentration naturally fluctuates. In room 206, German language instruction was underway. Students engaged in structured exercises, practicing vocabulary and conversation under the guidance of their instructor. The atmosphere was one of learning and repetition, a controlled environment designed to build familiarity with linguistic patterns. There was nothing in the room that suggested imminent disruption. The door was part of the shared architectural space of the building, as it always had been, separating the classroom from the hallway, but not isolating it from the world. In other classrooms, similar scenes unfolded. Engineering lectures were in progress, filled with diagrams, equations, and technical explanation. Students were immersed in problem-solving processes that required sustained attention. The intellectual focus of these spaces created a kind of internal world, where external concerns rarely intruded during the flow of instruction. It was into these environments that Cho moved. The first disruption came suddenly. The sound was immediate and unfamiliar in its intensity. Within a classroom, such a sound does not initially register as something specific. The human mind often attempts to categorize unexpected noise into known patterns. A dropped object, a malfunctioning device, a distant sound carried through ventilation systems. In academic settings, where structured learning dominates perception, the assumption of normality is often the first response. But the sound repeated. At that point, the structure of interpretation began to collapse. Inside the classrooms, confusion spread almost instantly. Students looked toward each other, searching for cues, trying to interpret the situation through collective reaction. Professors paused mid-sentence, their attention shifting from instruction to uncertainty. The predictable flow of academic exchange broke down as the reality of what was happening began to override the assumptions of normal classroom behavior. In some rooms, students instinctively moved toward the floor or sought cover behind desks. In others, individuals attempted to understand the source of the disturbance, moving toward doors or windows to gain clarity. The absence of clear information created a psychological vacuum, where fear and confusion expanded rapidly. Cho moved from space to space within the building. The transition between rooms was swift, and each entry marked a new rupture in the internal order of the classroom environment. The structure of academic life, which depends on stability and controlled interaction, could not accommodate the sudden intrusion of violence. Within seconds, spaces that had been dedicated to learning were transformed into environments of survival. Students reacted in ways that reflected both instinct and training. Some attempted to barricade doors using furniture, pushing desks and chairs into place with urgent, uncoordinated movement. Others sought escape through windows, a decision driven by immediate perception of threat and lack of viable alternatives. In upper floors, this choice carried significant risk, but in the absence of other options, it became the only path perceived as available. The sound within the building became layered and chaotic. Voices overlapped, not in structured communication, but in fragmented responses to rapidly unfolding danger. The clarity of academic instruction was replaced by disordered urgency. The geometry of the classroom, once defined by rows, boards, and fixed attention, dissolved into unpredictable motion. In room 207, students and faculty attempted to respond collectively. The instructor moved toward the door, trying to assess the situation, while students reacted in different directions. Some froze, unable to process the speed at which events were unfolding. Others moved instinctively, driven by immediate survival response rather than structured decision-making. The space itself became compressed, not physically, but psychologically, as perception narrowed to immediate threats and possible exits. Outside the classrooms, the hallway became a corridor of uncertainty. The building's design, which typically supported smooth movement between academic spaces, now created confined channels where movement was restricted and visibility was limited. Doors that had previously functioned as simple entry points now became barriers separating safety from danger, though at the time, no one could fully understand the extent of what was occurring across the building. Within this rapidly collapsing structure of normalcy, communication systems struggled to respond. Information moved slowly through official channels, delayed by the initial misunderstanding of the situation as a contained incident. This delay had consequences that would later be scrutinized extensively, but in the moment, it contributed to the widening gap between reality and response. Inside Norris Hall, time became fragmented. For those present, minutes felt stretched beyond their actual duration. The human perception of time under extreme stress often distorts, creating a sense that events are both rapid and prolonged simultaneously. Each moment carried an intensity that made it difficult to process what was happening in real time. Cho continued moving through the building. The sequence of events unfolded in a way that left little opportunity for external intervention during its most critical phase. The confined nature of classroom spaces meant that individuals inside were often unable to fully comprehend the situation before it reached them directly. The architecture of the building, designed for education rather than emergency containment, played an unintentional role in shaping the progression of events. As the situation escalated, the campus outside Norris Hall remained largely unaware. Classes continued in other buildings. Students walked between lectures. The contrast between ordinary campus life and the unfolding tragedy inside one building created a stark division within the same physical space. Eventually, the sound of emergency response began to emerge in the distance. Sirens approached the campus, signaling that external awareness of the situation was rapidly increasing. But by the time this awareness reached full clarity, the most critical phase inside Norris Hall had already concluded. When law enforcement finally entered the building, they encountered a space that had already been transformed beyond recognition. The violence had ended, but its presence remained embedded in the physical and emotional structure of the environment. The immediate aftermath revealed the extent of what had occurred within a compressed span of time. Classrooms that had once been spaces of instruction now held the silence of aftermath. Desks, papers, and personal belongings remained in place, marking the abrupt interruption of normal activity. The incident had unfolded quickly, but its impact would extend far beyond the time it occupied. In the hours that followed, as the university began to understand the scale of what had taken place, the narrative of April 16 shifted from confusion to recognition. What had initially been perceived as isolated disturbance was now understood as a coordinated act of violence that had affected multiple spaces within a single building. The events inside Norris Hall would become central to every subsequent investigation, analysis, and reflection on the tragedy. But for those who experienced it directly, the memory of those minutes would remain something far more personal than any official account could fully capture. It was the moment when the structure of ordinary academic life collapsed into something unrecognizable, and the boundary between safety and catastrophe disappeared within the span of a single morning. When the first emergency calls began to reach campus police on the morning of April 16, 2007, the information was fragmented, incomplete, and dangerously ambiguous. In the early stages of crisis, clarity is often the first casualty. Reports arrived in pieces, each one shaped by fear, confusion, and the limited perspective of those witnessing only a fraction of the unfolding situation. At Virginia Tech, this fragmentation would have profound consequences, as authorities attempted to reconstruct reality in real time while reality itself continued to evolve beyond their control. The initial incident at West Ambler Johnston Hall had been interpreted as an isolated act. A single location. A contained situation. This interpretation shaped the early response. Officers arrived at the residence hall to secure the area, to investigate what was believed to be a targeted event rather than a broader threat. In the absence of confirmed additional danger, the campus continued to function under the assumption that the situation, while serious, was limited in scope. That assumption would soon be shattered. Inside the residence hall, investigators were confronted with the immediate aftermath of violence that did not yet have a clear context. The scene was disorienting in its abruptness. A space designed for student living had been transformed into something unrecognizable. There were no immediate indicators suggesting a wider attack, no visible signs pointing toward a second phase. The natural human inclination, in such moments, is to seek explanation within familiar frameworks. Personal conflict. Isolated grievance. A dispute that escalated beyond control. Nothing in the early evidence contradicted that assumption strongly enough to force an immediate campus-wide alert. And so, communication moved cautiously. While this was happening, life continued across Virginia Tech. Students attended morning classes. Professors delivered lectures. Administrative offices processed routine tasks. The campus functioned as a distributed system of independent units, each operating within its own schedule and responsibility. In such systems, information must travel through structured channels before it becomes actionable. That structure, designed for order and accuracy, also introduces delay. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the first official warnings began to circulate within limited administrative and security networks. These warnings were localized, focused on West Ambler Johnston Hall, and did not yet extend to a full campus emergency alert. The decision-making process at this stage was shaped by uncertainty. Authorities had to weigh the risk of causing widespread panic against the risk of failing to warn a population that might be in danger. Without confirmed evidence of a continuing threat, caution prevailed. That caution would later be scrutinized extensively, but in the moment, it reflected standard protocol for situations that appeared contained. At the same time, Sung Hui Cho was already moving toward Norris Hall. There was no communication between these two parallel realities. One side was attempting to interpret a single incident as safely as possible. The other was transitioning into a second and far more devastating phase. This separation in awareness created a critical gap in response capability. Inside Norris Hall, classes were underway. Students were seated, focused on instruction, unaware that the building they occupied was about to become the center of a rapidly unfolding crisis. The architecture of the building, with its interconnected classrooms and internal corridors, allowed for efficient academic use, but offered limited barriers between spaces. Doors opened into shared hallways, and movement between rooms was typically unimpeded. At approximately 9:40 a.m., that structure of normal academic flow was disrupted. Emergency calls began to shift in tone and urgency. Reports from Norris Hall described sounds that could no longer be interpreted as incidental or isolated. The language used by callers reflected escalating awareness of danger, though still without full comprehension of its scale. Within dispatch centers, operators worked quickly to verify information, cross-check locations, and determine whether this represented an extension of the earlier incident or a separate, unrelated event. The possibility of multiple active threats was still not fully confirmed. As a result, response units began to converge on campus, but without a complete picture of what awaited them. Officers moved toward Norris Hall while communication lines attempted to synchronize fragmented reports from different parts of the university. This is a critical feature of crisis response. Action must often begin before understanding is complete. Delay in action can be as dangerous as action taken on incomplete information, yet premature escalation carries its own risks. Inside the building, the situation had already escalated beyond the threshold of containment. Students and faculty inside classrooms were experiencing rapidly shifting conditions. Initial confusion gave way to recognition that something was fundamentally wrong. The transition from uncertainty to understanding in such moments is psychologically disorienting. The mind resists immediate acceptance of extreme threat, instead attempting to reconcile it with familiar categories of experience. But as sensory evidence accumulates, that resistance collapses. At that point, survival responses take over. Some individuals attempted to communicate with emergency services using mobile phones, though in many cases the speed of unfolding events made sustained communication impossible. Others focused entirely on immediate physical safety, seeking cover, or attempting to secure exits. The variability of response reflected the absence of unified instruction, as no coordinated alert had yet reached the building at scale. Outside Norris Hall, the campus remained largely unaware of the full scope of what was occurring inside. This disconnection between internal and external awareness is a defining feature of many large-scale emergencies in complex environments. Information does not propagate uniformly. Instead, it moves through networks of communication that can lag behind rapidly changing reality. At approximately 9:45 a.m., the first indications of a broader emergency began to emerge more clearly within campus security channels. The possibility that multiple locations were involved could no longer be dismissed. At this stage, the response shifted from localized investigation to active emergency mobilization. Officers were directed toward Norris Hall with increasing urgency. But even as this shift occurred, the critical phase inside the building was already well underway. Within Norris Hall, the structural design of classrooms created isolated pockets of experience. Each room contained its own unfolding reality, separated from others by walls and doors that were never intended to function as defensive barriers. This separation meant that individuals within one room often had limited awareness of what was occurring just meters away. This fragmentation of perception contributed to the difficulty of immediate coordinated response from within the building itself. As emergency units approached, the sound of sirens began to register across campus. For those not yet aware of the situation, these sounds introduced confusion. Sirens are common in urban environments and do not always indicate specific location or severity. Without clear communication, they can be interpreted in multiple ways, ranging from routine medical emergencies to more serious incidents elsewhere in town. This ambiguity persisted until direct confirmation reached wider administrative systems. At approximately 9:50 a.m., campus-wide awareness began to shift rapidly. The understanding that a second, more serious incident was occurring inside Norris Hall spread through official channels. At this point, the nature of the response changed fundamentally. What had been treated as a contained investigation became an active mass casualty emergency. Law enforcement units began to organize tactical entry into the building. However, entry into Norris Hall was not immediate. Officers had to assess entry points, coordinate movement, and prepare for the possibility of ongoing threat inside. In active shooter situations, every second must be balanced against the need for officer safety and effective containment. This balance is difficult, as delaying entry can increase risk to those inside, while immediate entry without preparation can endanger responders. Inside the building, the situation was still developing in real time. By the time officers reached the exterior of Norris Hall, the internal phase of the incident was nearing its conclusion. The window between first awareness and physical entry is often the most critical period in such events, and in this case, it was compressed into minutes that carried immense consequence. When entry was finally executed, officers encountered a scene that confirmed the worst fears of escalating reports. The violence had already occurred, leaving behind a space marked by abrupt interruption and profound loss. The transition from active crisis to immediate aftermath happened within a short span, but its emotional and operational impact was significant. In the hours that followed, investigators worked to reconstruct the sequence of events inside Norris Hall. This process involved mapping timelines, analyzing entry points, and correlating witness accounts from survivors across multiple classrooms. Each account added a fragment to the larger picture, gradually forming an understanding of how the incident had unfolded across time and space. The discovery phase of the investigation revealed not only what had happened, but also how quickly information had lagged behind reality. The gap between initial incident, recognition of escalation, and full-scale response became a central focus of later analysis. For those involved in emergency response, this period marked a critical learning moment about the challenges of interpreting incomplete information in real time. For the university community, it marked the beginning of a long process of understanding how a normal academic morning could transition into one of the most devastating events in campus history. The scene inside Norris Hall would remain under investigation for an extended period, but its immediate significance was already clear. It represented the point at which ordinary assumptions about safety and continuity were permanently disrupted, replaced by the recognition that even familiar environments can become sites of sudden and irreversible change. In the hours and days following April 16, 2007, as shock settled into grief and grief began to settle into questions, attention naturally turned toward understanding how such an event could have occurred without intervention. In every major investigation of mass violence, there is a moment when the narrative shifts from the immediate horror of what happened to the slower, more methodical attempt to understand why it happened and whether it could have been prevented. At Virginia Tech, that process began almost immediately, but it quickly revealed something far more complex than a single failure or oversight. The early investigation centered on two connected but distinct threads. The first was the sequence of events inside West Ambler Johnston Hall and Norris Hall. The second was the identity and history of Sung-Hui Cho. These two threads would eventually converge into a single story, but at the outset, they were approached separately, as investigators attempted to reconstruct both the timeline of violence and the psychological path that may have led to it. Initially, there were few clear suspects beyond the obvious presence of Cho as the perpetrator. In cases of this nature, investigators often begin by considering whether additional individuals may have been involved, whether through planning, assistance, or awareness of intent. However, as evidence accumulated, it became increasingly clear that Cho had acted alone in carrying out the attack. This realization narrowed the focus of the investigation, but deepened the challenge of understanding motive and internal process. Attention then turned to Cho's personal history within the university and beyond. Records revealed a pattern of social withdrawal that had been present long before his arrival at Virginia Tech. From his early years, there were indications of difficulty in communication, persistent isolation, and challenges in forming interpersonal connections. These characteristics, while not inherently predictive of violence, became part of the broader psychological profile that investigators examined in hindsight. During his time at Virginia Tech, Cho's behavior had raised concerns among faculty and peers. Some instructors reported discomfort during interactions, noting his reluctance or inability to engage in typical classroom participation. His writing assignments had, at times, drawn attention due to their unusual tone and content. In certain cases, this led to internal university evaluations, aimed at assessing whether he posed a risk to himself or others. Mental health assessments conducted prior to 2007 had identified significant concerns. Diagnoses related to severe anxiety and depressive symptoms were documented, and at one point, a court order required him to undergo outpatient treatment. This legal intervention was the result of earlier incidents that suggested a need for structured psychological support. Following treatment, he was allowed to continue his academic studies. However, the presence of diagnosis and treatment did not translate into continuous monitoring or sustained intervention. Once legal obligations were met, responsibility for ongoing care shifted largely to the individual. This is a common feature of mental health systems that balance civil liberties with clinical oversight, but in retrospect, it became one of the focal points of public scrutiny after the tragedy. As investigators examined Cho's university life, they also reviewed interactions between him and various administrative and counseling services. These records showed limited engagement in voluntary support systems. While resources were available on campus, there was no consistent pattern of utilization that might have indicated escalating distress to institutional observers. At the same time, investigators explored whether any warning signs had been communicated informally among students or faculty. In large university environments, individuals who exhibit social withdrawal or behavioral differences are often noticed, but not always formally reported. In Cho's case, there were instances where his behavior had been observed as unusual, but these observations did not coalesce into a unified concern that reached administrative action at a level capable of triggering intervention. This gap between observation and action became a central theme in the investigation. It raised difficult questions about how institutions interpret behavioral signals that are ambiguous in nature. Many of the traits associated with Cho's isolation could also be found in students who were simply introverted, socially anxious, or culturally displaced. The challenge for any institution is distinguishing between personal variation and potential risk without overpathologizing difference. Parallel to this psychological inquiry was the examination of how Cho obtained the weapons used in the attack. Investigators determined that he had legally purchased 2 handguns in the months leading up to April 2007. These transactions were conducted through licensed dealers, and background checks at the time did not prevent the purchases. This fact became a significant point of national discussion, as it highlighted limitations within the existing system for screening individuals with prior mental health concerns. The investigation into his acquisition of firearms did not reveal any illegal procurement channels or external assistance. Instead, It confirmed that existing regulatory frameworks had not flagged him as ineligible under the criteria in place at the time. This finding shifted part of the post-incident discourse toward legislative and policy considerations regarding firearm access and mental health reporting systems. Another area of focus was Cho's digital and written output in the period leading up to the attack. Investigators reviewed materials he had sent to media outlets during the incident itself, including video recordings and written statements. These materials were analyzed for insight into his mindset and possible ideological framing. The content revealed expressions of anger, alienation, and identification with acts of mass violence, though not in a structured ideological form that would align with organized extremist movements. Instead, what emerged was a fragmented internal narrative marked by resentment and perceived victimization. The language used in these materials reflected a deeply personal worldview rather than affiliation with a broader political or religious cause. This distinction was important for investigators, as it placed the case within a category of individualized mass violence rather than coordinated terrorism. As the investigation expanded, attention also turned toward institutional response during the early hours of the incident. This included a detailed reconstruction of communication timelines, decision-making processes, and emergency protocols. Investigators examined how information about the initial shooting at West Ambler Johnston Hall was processed, and how that information influenced the timing and scope of campus alerts. One of the most scrutinized aspects was the delay in issuing a campus-wide warning. The decision not to immediately broadcast an alert after the first incident was based on the interpretation that it was isolated. This interpretation, while reasonable based on available information at the time, became a central point of critique after the second attack revealed that the threat was not contained. The investigation did not frame this delay as a single point of failure, but rather as a convergence of procedural design, incomplete information, and the inherent difficulty of interpreting unfolding events in real time. Emergency systems are designed to avoid unnecessary panic, but they also depend on accurate situational assessment, which can be difficult in the earliest stages of crisis. In parallel, investigators reviewed the physical layout of Norris Hall and its role in the progression of events. The building's design, typical of many academic structures, prioritized accessibility and internal circulation. Doors, corridors, and classroom arrangements facilitated movement and learning, but did not incorporate security features designed for high-threat scenarios. This architectural context became part of broader discussions about how educational environments balance openness with safety. The question was not whether the building was improperly designed, but whether design assumptions rooted in normal conditions could adequately account for extreme, low-probability events. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that there was no single point of failure that could fully explain the outcome. Instead, the tragedy emerged from the intersection of multiple factors: individual psychological deterioration, gaps in institutional communication, limitations in legal and medical frameworks, and the inherent unpredictability of human behavior. Each of these elements, when examined in isolation, appeared insufficient to prevent the outcome. Together, they formed a complex system in which warning signs were present, but not fully integrated into a coherent response mechanism. For investigators, this realization marked a shift from searching for a singular cause to mapping a network of contributing conditions. It also underscored the difficulty of prevention in systems where risk is diffuse and signals are ambiguous. As interviews were conducted with survivors, faculty, and administrators, additional layers of understanding emerged. These accounts provided insight into how individuals within the system experienced the same environment differently, and how perception of risk varied depending on proximity and context. By the end of this phase of investigation, the case had moved beyond the question of who and what into a deeper inquiry about how modern institutions recognize and respond to emerging threats. It was no longer solely about reconstructing a sequence of events, but about understanding the structural conditions that allowed those events to unfold with such speed and scale. The answers that emerged were complex, incomplete, and in many ways unsettling, because they did not point to a single correctable error. Instead, they revealed a system operating within its intended design parameters, yet still unable to anticipate a form of violence that defied those expectations. In the aftermath of the initial investigation, as details of April 16, 2007 became clearer and more structured, the narrative of the Virginia Tech shooting began to shift toward a different kind of focus. The question was no longer only what had happened or how it had unfolded, but what might have signaled it in advance, and whether there had been any point at which the trajectory of events could have been altered. Within that search for understanding, attention increasingly turned toward the moments that preceded the tragedy, the fragmented signs that, in hindsight, appeared to point toward an individual moving steadily away from stability. Sunghui Cho's life before that morning did not contain a single defining moment that could be isolated as the origin of what followed. Instead, it was characterized by accumulation. A series of experiences, observations, and interventions that, when viewed individually, appeared incomplete, but when placed together formed a pattern of deepening isolation and internal withdrawal. This accumulation did not move in a straight line. It did not escalate in a way that was obvious or easily interpretable in real time. It unfolded gradually, often invisibly, within the boundaries of everyday academic life. Within Virginia Tech, Cho had already been identified at various points as a student requiring attention. His behavior in classroom settings was often described as detached. He rarely engaged in spontaneous interaction. When required to participate, his responses were limited and sometimes difficult for others to interpret. In environments where communication and participation are central, such absence becomes noticeable, but not always actionable. There is a threshold between difference and concern, and Cho's behavior existed in that ambiguous space for much of his time at the university. Faculty members who interacted with him occasionally reported discomfort or uncertainty about how to engage with him effectively. His written work sometimes reflected themes that were unusual in tone or perspective, leading to internal discussions about whether additional support or evaluation was necessary. These concerns contributed to formal assessments, but those assessments did not produce a consistent or continuous intervention over time. Outside the classroom, Cho's social world appeared extremely limited. There was little evidence of sustained peer relationships. In large university environments, social isolation can take many forms, ranging from quiet independence to complete withdrawal. In Cho's case, the latter became more apparent as time progressed. He was often described as present, but disconnected, moving through shared spaces, without integration into the informal networks that typically define student life. Years before the events of 2007, Cho had already come into contact with mental health services and legal systems due to concerns about his behavior. These interactions resulted in structured evaluations and mandated treatment. At the time, these measures were intended to address immediate concerns rather than predict future risk. Mental health intervention systems are designed primarily around present assessment, focusing on stabilization and management rather than long-term behavioral forecasting. After completing the requirements imposed by those interventions, Cho continued his academic path. Like many individuals who undergo treatment, he returned to daily life without ongoing institutional monitoring beyond standard academic oversight. This transition from structured intervention to relative independence is a common feature of mental health systems, but in retrospect, it became a point of critical reflection. Within the university context, there was no continuous mechanism that integrated past mental health concerns with ongoing behavioral observation in a way that would have flagged escalating risk in real time. Information existed in separate administrative and clinical domains, but but those domains did not operate as a unified predictive system. As a result, earlier concerns remained compartmentalized rather than dynamically connected to later observations. In the period leading up to April 2007, Cho's internal world became increasingly opaque to those around him. There were no widely recognized public indicators of imminent violence. Instead, there was continued withdrawal, reduced communication, and a deepening separation from academic and social engagement. This pattern, while concerning in retrospect, did not produce a clear trigger for intervention under the systems in place at the time. At the same time, Cho began to acquire materials that would later be used in the attack. These acquisitions were conducted through legal channels, reflecting existing regulatory frameworks that permitted firearm purchases under specific conditions. Background checks were conducted, but they did not identify disqualifying factors that would prevent the transactions. This aspect of the case later became central to national discussions about the relationship between mental health history and firearm access. However, from an investigative standpoint, the purchase of weapons was not viewed in isolation. It was examined as part of a broader timeline of behavioral and situational changes. The challenge for investigators was not simply identifying what was done, but understanding how multiple systems operating independently failed to converge on a shared perception of risk. As the investigation moved into this phase, attention also turned toward Cho's creative and written expressions. In the months leading up to the shooting, he had produced materials that reflected intense emotional distress and alienation. These materials were not shared widely prior to the incident and were only fully analyzed afterward. They revealed a narrative structure centered on perceived injustice, social exclusion, and internalized grievance. The language within these materials was fragmented, shifting between self-reference and external critique. There was no coherent ideological framework in the traditional sense, but there was a consistent emotional tone marked by resentment and detachment. For psychologists and investigators, this presented a complex interpretive challenge. The content suggested distress, but not necessarily a clear predictive pathway to violent action. Within academic environments, such expressions might have been interpreted differently depending on context. Creative writing, personal reflection, and academic experimentation can sometimes overlap with emotionally intense themes without indicating risk. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between expression and escalation, particularly when expression is not part of an ongoing dialogue with others. As investigators reconstructed Cho's trajectory, they also examined his interactions within campus systems designed to identify and respond to student distress. Counseling services, academic advisors, and faculty reporting mechanisms all existed within the institutional structure. However, these systems depended heavily on initiation from either the student or those directly observing concerning behavior at a significant level. In Cho's case, there was limited sustained engagement with voluntary support systems. While he had been evaluated previously, there was no continuous therapeutic relationship maintained within the university context that might have provided ongoing insight into his evolving mental state. This absence of continuity meant that changes in behavior were observed only indirectly and intermittently. Another critical factor examined during this phase was the interpretation of behavioral ambiguity. Many of the signs later associated with Cho's isolation could, in isolation, be interpreted in multiple ways. Social withdrawal might indicate introversion. Limited communication might reflect personality differences or cultural adaptation challenges. Even unusual written content can exist within the broad spectrum of academic exploration. The challenge for any institution is that risk signals are rarely unambiguous before a critical threshold is crossed. This ambiguity created what investigators later described as a zone of interpretive uncertainty. Within this zone, behaviors are noticed, but not clearly categorized as requiring urgent intervention. It is within this space that many preventive systems struggle, because action requires clarity, while real-world signals are often incomplete. As part of the breakthrough phase of the investigation, attention also focused on the temporal proximity between earlier interventions in Cho's life and the eventual attack. Analysts examined whether there had been missed opportunities for sustained follow-up after prior mental health evaluations. These examinations revealed gaps not necessarily in procedure, but in continuity. Systems designed to respond to immediate concerns did not always extend into long-term monitoring unless specific conditions were met. At the same time, investigators began to reconstruct the final months before April 16 with greater precision. This included mapping movement patterns, reviewing academic records, and analyzing available communication data. What emerged was not a sudden transformation, but a continuation of existing patterns of isolation that gradually became more entrenched. The absence of dramatic behavioral shifts made prediction particularly difficult. There was no single moment that clearly indicated escalation in a way that would have triggered immediate systemic response under existing protocols. Instead, there was a slow convergence of factors that, only in retrospect, appeared aligned toward a catastrophic outcome. As this understanding developed, the concept of a breakthrough in the investigation did not refer to a single discovery, but rather to a shift in perspective. The focus moved from identifying a direct cause to understanding structural limitations in how institutions interpret human behavior over time. This shift also reframed earlier assumptions about preventability. It suggested that while individual elements of Cho's history were observable, the integration of those elements into a coherent risk assessment framework did not occur within the systems available at the time. This was not framed as a failure of intent, but as a limitation of design. By the end of this phase, investigators had developed a more comprehensive understanding of how multiple independent factors converged without detection. Cho's psychological history, behavioral isolation, prior interventions, and access to means all existed within separate systems that did not fully communicate with one another in a predictive capacity. The breakthrough, therefore, was not the identification of a single missed warning, but the recognition of systemic fragmentation. It was the understanding that prevention in such cases depends not only on observation, but on integration, continuity, and interpretation across multiple domains. And within that realization lay the most difficult conclusion of all, that even when signs exist, they may not form a clear enough pattern to trigger action until it is already too late. In the aftermath of the Virginia Tech shooting, the question of justice did not begin in a courtroom. It began in silence. In the days following April 16, 2007, the campus of Virginia Tech existed in a suspended emotional state, where grief and disbelief occupied every space that had once been filled with routine academic life. Before legal proceedings, before official reports, before any formal assignment of responsibility beyond the obvious, there was only the human need to understand what had happened and how the system would respond to it. Yet in this case, traditional concepts of justice would take a different form. There was no long criminal trial. There was no defense, no cross-examination, no deliberation by a jury. The central perpetrator, Seung-Hui Cho, had already died at the scene. His self-inflicted death at Norris Hall brought the legal dimension of accountability to an immediate and irreversible end. What remained was not punishment, but inquiry. Not judgment in the courtroom sense, but examination at every level of institutional and national response. In most criminal cases, the courtroom serves as the final stage where narrative becomes legally defined. Evidence is presented, intent is debated, and responsibility is assigned through structured legal reasoning. But here, that process was absent. Instead, justice unfolded through investigation, public inquiry, and policy reassessment. It became decentralized, distributed across commissions, reports, hearings, and internal reviews. The first layer of this process involved the official investigation into the events themselves. Law enforcement agencies worked to reconstruct the timeline of both the initial shooting at West Ambler Johnston Hall and the subsequent massacre at Norris Hall. This reconstruction was based on forensic evidence, survivor testimony, electronic records, and physical examination of the crime scenes. Every detail was analyzed to establish not only what occurred, but the sequence in which it occurred, down to the minute. This factual reconstruction served a dual purpose. It provided clarity for the public record, and it also formed the basis for evaluating institutional response. Because in the absence of a courtroom trial, responsibility would be assessed through procedural analysis rather than adversarial argument. One of the most scrutinized elements of this analysis was the timeline of emergency communication. Investigators examined why a campus-wide alert was not issued immediately after the first shooting. The decision-making process within university administration and campus police became a central focus of inquiry. Officials had initially interpreted the first incident as isolated, based on available evidence at the time. That interpretation influenced the scope and speed of the initial response. However, when the second attack occurred at Norris Hall, it became clear that the earlier assessment had not reflected the full scope of the threat. This realization raised difficult questions about how information is evaluated in rapidly evolving crises. It also exposed the tension between caution and urgency in emergency management systems. In parallel with law enforcement investigation, the university itself initiated internal reviews. These reviews examined communication protocols, emergency preparedness procedures, and the flow of information between departments during the critical early hours of April 16. The goal was not only to understand what had happened, but to identify how similar delays or misinterpretations might be prevented in the future. At a national level, the shooting triggered broader discussions about institutional responsibility. The fact that Cho had previously undergone mental health evaluations became a focal point of public debate. Questions were raised about how information regarding mental health is recorded, shared, and acted upon within both educational and legal systems. These questions did not produce simple answers, because they touched on complex issues of privacy, civil rights, and public safety. The absence of a courtroom trial meant that public understanding of responsibility had to be constructed through other means. One of those means was the formation of investigative commissions. These bodies were tasked with conducting comprehensive reviews of the events, interviewing witnesses, analyzing institutional practices, and producing formal reports that would serve as the closest equivalent to a judicial record. These reports did not assign criminal guilt, but they did evaluate performance, decision-making, and systemic effectiveness. They identified areas where communication had been delayed, where assumptions had influenced response, and where existing protocols had not anticipated the specific nature of the unfolding situation. At the same time, there was a parallel dimension of justice that existed outside institutional frameworks. For the families of the victims, justice was not primarily about policy or procedure. It was about acknowledgement, remembrance, and the preservation of individual identity beyond the moment of tragedy. Memorial services held at Virginia Tech became spaces where names were spoken aloud, where stories were shared, and where the individuality of each victim was reaffirmed in the face of collective loss. These moments served as a counterbalance to the abstraction of statistics and reports. While investigations focused on systems and timelines, memorials focused on people. The two forms of understanding existed simultaneously, but addressed different needs. One sought explanation. The other sought meaning. Within the university community, there was also an ongoing process of informal justice. This took the form of reflection, dialogue, and internal reassessment of what safety meant within an academic environment. Students and faculty alike questioned assumptions that had previously gone unexamined. The idea that a university campus could be inherently safe was no longer taken for granted. Instead, safety became something understood as conditional, dependent on systems, communication, and awareness. As official investigations progressed, attention also turned toward policy implications. The Virginia Tech tragedy became a reference point in national discussions about emergency alert systems in educational institutions. It contributed to changes in how universities are required to communicate threats, particularly in situations involving active danger on campus. These changes reflected an attempt to translate lessons learned into structural improvements. However, policy change does not operate as immediate justice. It functions over time, gradually altering procedures and expectations. For those directly affected by the events, such changes could not reverse what had already occurred. They represented forward-looking attempts to prevent repetition rather than retroactive correction. Another dimension of post-incident justice involved public discourse about mental health systems. The fact that Cho had previously been identified as someone requiring psychological evaluation led to widespread examination of how mental health data is managed. Discussions emerged around the balance between confidentiality and safety, and whether existing frameworks adequately supported early intervention in cases of severe psychological distress. These debates were complex because they involved competing ethical principles. Protecting individual privacy is a core value of mental health care. At the same time, preventing harm to others is a central responsibility of public institutions. The Virginia Tech case forced these principles into direct conversation, without offering a simple resolution. In the legal sense, the case against Cho ended with his death. But in the broader sense of accountability, the story did not end. Instead, it shifted into a multi-layered process of examination that extended across institutional, legal, and societal levels. Justice, in this context, became less about punishment and more about understanding and adaptation. As reports were finalized and findings were published, a more structured narrative of responsibility began to emerge. It was not centered on a single failure, but on a series of interconnected limitations. Communication delays, interpretive uncertainty, structural assumptions about safety, and gaps in information integration all contributed to a situation in which warning signs did not coalesce into actionable response in time. This conclusion was difficult for many to accept, because it lacked the clarity of a singular cause. It suggested instead that the conditions for prevention were distributed across systems that did not fully align under stress. In this sense, justice became inseparable from complexity. It was not a matter of assigning blame to one individual or institution, but of understanding how multiple systems interact under extreme conditions. For the Virginia Tech community, this phase of reflection marked a transition from immediate grief to longer-term processing. The courtroom stage of justice, which typically provides closure through verdict and sentencing, was replaced here by a more gradual and ongoing form of reckoning. Even years later, the question of justice in the Virginia Tech shooting remains layered. It exists in memorials, in policy changes, in academic studies of crisis response, and in the continued effort to understand how such an event could emerge within an environment dedicated to learning and growth. What remains clear is that justice in this case was not a single moment of resolution. It was a process without a definitive endpoint, shaped by investigation, reflection, and the continuous effort to extract meaning from a tragedy that resisted simple explanation. In the days and weeks following April 16, 2007, Virginia Tech entered a phase that could not be described simply as recovery. What followed was not a return to normalcy, but the slow construction of a new emotional and institutional reality built on top of what had been irrevocably lost. The campus remained physically intact, but its psychological landscape had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. Every building, Every walkway, every classroom carried the invisible weight of what had occurred inside Norris Hall and West Ambler Johnston Hall. The aftermath of a mass casualty event is not a single moment, but a prolonged state of transition. For Virginia Tech, that transition began immediately. Students left campus to be with families. Those who remained moved through spaces that felt altered, as if the familiar geometry of the university had been subtly rearranged by trauma. Silence became more noticeable. Ordinary sounds felt different, sharper, more present. The absence of those who had been lost was not abstract, it was embedded in the daily rhythm of campus life. Memorials began to form almost spontaneously. Flowers appeared near buildings. Handwritten notes were placed on walls, railings, and sidewalks. Candles were lit in gatherings that grew larger each evening as word spread across the country and the world. These acts were not organized initially by institutions, but by individuals seeking ways to express what could not be fully articulated through language alone. Grief, in this context, found expression through physical presence and shared silence. Within a short time, these spontaneous memorials evolved into structured commemorations. The university organized official services that brought together students, faculty, families, and public officials. These gatherings were marked by moments of collective mourning, where names were spoken slowly, each one carrying a weight that could not be quantified. For those in attendance, hearing the names of the victims transformed the event from a distant tragedy into a deeply personal loss. Each name represented a life that had extended beyond the campus. Families who attended these memorials brought with them stories that extended far beyond academic records or official descriptions. They spoke of childhood memories, aspirations, personalities, and small details that defined the individuals beyond their final moments. These narratives restored dimension to lives that had been briefly reduced to headlines and statistics. At the same time, the university faced the practical challenge of continuing its academic mission. Decisions had to be made about whether to resume classes, how to support students emotionally, and how to balance continuity with respect for mourning. Eventually, classes resumed, but the atmosphere was fundamentally different. Professors approached lectures with heightened sensitivity. Students returned to classrooms carrying visible and invisible burdens. The act of learning itself became intertwined with grief. Counseling services expanded rapidly in response to overwhelming demand. Mental health professionals were brought in from outside institutions to support the university community. These services became central to the recovery process, offering spaces where students and staff could process trauma in ways that were structured, confidential, and ongoing. The scale of emotional impact required sustained attention rather than short-term intervention. In parallel, Virginia Tech began a long process of institutional reflection. Administrators reviewed emergency protocols, communication systems, and crisis response procedures. One of the most significant outcomes of this period was the revision of campus alert systems. The events of April 16 had demonstrated the critical importance of timely and unambiguous communication in situations of potential danger. As a result, new procedures were developed to ensure that alerts could be issued more quickly and across multiple platforms simultaneously. These changes were not limited to Virginia Tech. Across the United States, universities examined their own emergency preparedness systems in light of what had occurred. The tragedy became a reference point in discussions about how educational institutions should respond to active threats. Policies were updated, drills were revised, and communication infrastructures were strengthened. In this sense, the impact of the event extended far beyond a single campus, influencing national standards for crisis response in higher education. Another significant aspect of the aftermath involved the public discourse surrounding mental health. Cho's history of psychological evaluation and treatment became central to broader conversations about how mental illness is understood and managed within both educational and legal systems. Advocates, policymakers, and mental health professionals engaged in difficult discussions about the limitations of existing frameworks. One of the key tensions in these discussions was the balance between privacy and prevention. Mental health records are protected for important ethical reasons, ensuring that individuals can seek treatment without fear of unnecessary exposure. However, the Virginia Tech case raised questions about whether existing protections adequately allowed for risk assessment in situations where potential harm to others might be involved. These debates did not produce immediate consensus, but they contributed to ongoing efforts to refine policies governing information sharing in high-risk contexts. For survivors of the shooting, the aftermath was a deeply personal and often complex journey. Some returned to academic life relatively quickly, while others required extended time away from the university. The psychological impact of surviving a mass casualty event does not follow a uniform pattern. It manifests differently in each individual, shaped by proximity, experience, and personal resilience. Many survivors described changes in how they experienced everyday environments. Classrooms, once associated with routine academic focus, became spaces where awareness of exits, surroundings, and potential threats became more pronounced. These changes in perception reflected the lasting imprint of trauma on cognitive and emotional processing. Recovery, in this sense, was not about returning to a previous state, but about integrating the experience into a new understanding of safety and vulnerability. The university also established long-term support structures for those directly affected. Scholarships, memorial funds, and commemorative initiatives were created in honor of the victims. These efforts served both practical and symbolic purposes. They provided tangible assistance to families and students, while also ensuring that the names of those lost would remain present within the ongoing life of the institution. Over time, Norris Hall itself became a site of remembrance and reflection. The building was eventually renovated, but its history remained an inseparable part of its identity. Within academic communities, spaces associated with tragedy often carry dual meanings. They continue to function in their intended role while also serving as places of memory. This duality reflects the complexity of returning to normal activity in environments marked by loss. Public memory of the Virginia Tech shooting evolved gradually. In the immediate aftermath, attention was focused on facts, timelines, and emotional response. Over time, the event became part of a broader historical context that included other incidents of mass violence in educational settings. Comparisons were made, patterns were analyzed, and the shooting was often referenced in discussions about systemic vulnerability in institutions designed for openness and accessibility. Yet beneath these broader analyses, the individual human impact remained central. For families, friends, and members of the university community, the event did not become a historical abstraction. It remained a personal rupture that continued to influence daily life long after media attention had shifted elsewhere. Anniversaries of the tragedy became moments of reflection. Each year, the university community would pause to remember those who had been lost. These commemorations were often quiet, marked by speeches, moments of silence, and gatherings that emphasized remembrance over analysis. They served as reminders that while institutional and policy changes could address structural aspects of the tragedy, they could not replace what had been taken. As years passed, Virginia Tech continued to evolve. New students arrived, who had no direct memory of April 16, 2007, yet the legacy of the event remained embedded in campus culture. Emergency preparedness remained a visible part of university life. Counseling services maintained expanded roles. Memorial spaces continued to be maintained as part of the physical and emotional landscape of the institution. The aftermath of the shooting also influenced broader societal conversations about violence, safety, and community responsibility. It became part of a larger pattern of reflection on how institutions respond to rare but high-impact events. In this context, Virginia Tech was often referenced not only as a site of tragedy, but as a case study in response, adaptation, and long-term recovery. Ultimately, the aftermath of April 16 was not defined by resolution, but by continuity. It was a process that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, shaping policies, perceptions, and personal lives in ways that continued to unfold over time. The event did not conclude with the end of violence. It transitioned into a sustained period of reflection and transformation that became part of the university's identity. And within that ongoing process, the memory of what happened remained present, not as a static image, but as a living reminder of how quickly ordinary life can change, and how long the effects of that change can endure.